Good morning, everyone. Here we are wrapping up another week of learning at home. This is going to be another lesson that I really regret not being able to be with you in person because I really value the input and interaction that you would give me um, based on some of the things that I'm going to point out here. Um, I'm an odd character. Well, you already knew that, but um, even though I'm older, I've never been one to be fearful of this postmodern shift as a Christian, but what we're going to talk about today is just kind of the different perspectives that Christian thinkers and influencers have taken in response to uh, the realization that this postmodern shift was happening. And I suppose a good place to start is with the word deconstruction. So you should have already done Foucault. That's how you pronounce his name, Michel Foucault. Don't say Foucault. He's Foucault and Jacques Derrida. Yes, they're both French. Um, I'm going to leave Foucault aside and focus on Derrida because I think one of the biggest things that really scared more traditionally minded Christian pastors, teachers, was this word deconstruction. And here's my little definition. Deconstruction reveals the polarizing social structures and language that privileges some and marginalizes others. Deconstruction is a purposeful attempt to break down the cultural power of those who are privileged and to try to give more cultural power or agency, as the video that you watched on post-structuralism. Agency is a really big word. When you go to college next year, you'll, and especially if you take any kind of sociology classes, agency is a real big term in scholarship right now. We need to give more people agency. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the pros and cons of that. I mean, yes, everybody should have agency, but at what point does giving everybody power break down the ability to have any kind of a cohesive culture? That's kind of the ultimate question. So this word deconstruction, kind of raised red flags, and it seemed like a threat right away to whatever you want to call it. Western civilization, the American way of life, the way things have always been, all that kind of stuff that was challenged in the 60s. No wonder this term starts becoming popular in the 60s and on into the 70s in literary theory, and then more broadly in social theory. But let's take a look at these two concepts of privilege and marginalized, because that word marginalization is going to be a big part of postmodern theory. What privileges some? Well, we've talked about this in a little bit in the past when we were talking about race, but all kinds of things. Educational background, economic status, race, class, and gender. Those are things that either privilege you or they marginalize you. Up until the 1960s, uh, you know, American culture in particular, Western civilization in general, if you want to call it that, was fairly homogenous in terms of who were the privileged. And obviously, the privileged were white, male, educated people. And you got to remember, before the 60s, one of the things that made the 60s is that for the first time in history, people from all kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds were going to college. They were coming together at these college campuses with the enthusiasm and passion of being young. That had never happened before. For most of human history, unfortunately, education was the province of the privileged. So as more and more people of diverse backgrounds, as our culture gets more and more pluralistic in the second half of the 20th century, and that pluralism starts showing up on college campuses, that's where this challenge of recognizing who the marginalized are, who the privileged are, starts becoming more important. Um, Now, the marginalized, or sometimes you hear it like in quotation marks, the other. Who is the other? There's always been pluralism. There's always been more than just white males in American society or Western civilization. It's just that white educated males, and commercially successful economic elites. They're the ones that had the power, and the others, or the marginalized, knew their place, and they kept their place for the most part. So, women knew their place in the home. The African American community knew their place in their own little subcultures, and this goes back and back and back. So this is what you see, in the last little comic on those notes, where the dialect is deconstructing the other one. I have deconstructing you. This is what began to happen in the '60s. The marginalized, the other, the people who weren't the privileged, began challenging the status quo. This reality scared those who were in control, and among those that it scared were more traditional Christians. I mean, when you look at, if you go back to the very first, the C.S. Lewis on postmodernism, I mean, imagine yourself being a person who is traditional, educated, in a position of cultural control, and you start hearing things like this: there is no objective view of reality, because everyone is culturally determined. One culture is no better than any other. The West has a big bias of Western civilization going all the way back to the Greeks being something significant, something better. History is fiction. Knowledge is power. Well, we've been knowing that ever since Bacon. Ethical claims are mere sentiments. It all comes down to rhetoric. Who can be more convincing? Which is kind of ironic, because part of the postmodern thing is that disillusionment with meta-narratives, with stories that say this is the way that things are. So now it becomes ever more important, if you're going to try to weave a story about the way things are, you've got to be really convincing in the way that you do it. You've got to become more creative. So now I want to take a look at the context piece that has, on the one side, postmodernism, and on the other side, Andy Crouch and some other younger Christians. And I mentioned this a little bit before. I just point out Conyers' 4 observations here. Every culture throughout history attempts to speak universally with their art, their music, their language. Culture is all about a wholeness. In the midst of what seems like a fragmented society, we have these. This is our music. This is our art. This is our language. This is what defines our culture. But no culture ever completely succeeds in that achieving that universality. There's always people on the outside of the mainstream. There's always subcultures. Cultures eventually fatigue, and that leads him to that 4th point. Postmodernism is not a culture like modernity was. Modernity was a culture. Postmodernism is the fatigue of culture. It's a sign of the end of modernity, and for that reason, its critiques of modernity are telling. But here's where Conyers really makes a point. Now, he's a professor of theology at Baylor, long since retired, I'm sure, because this was from 2005, but maybe not. But when he wrote that, he was kind of an old school theologian. Postmodernism is not a new age, nor the sign of a new kind of culture. It despairs of culture. It cannot become a vessel for the gospel, for it is fundamentally anti-gospel, just as all signs of deconstruction, or destruction or deconstruction, and judgment can only serve as a warning. And then he goes down and says, culture both engenders and depends on life, not decay. And it is there, not in the decadent features of the modern West, but perhaps in the revivals of Africa and Asia and Africa, that we'll find the gospel truly working. So Conyers is basically saying that the gospel cannot work in the postmodern milieu, or whatever you want to call it, the ethos, because it is not a culture. It despairs of culture. It wants to undermine and deconstruct and destroy the existing culture. So this is what led, especially when I first started going to ACSI conventions and postmodernism started to be a thing, and books that every Christian in education was reading. It was all, this is the boogeyman, this is evil, this is you got to watch out. This is the next scary thing. But now contrast that with what Andy Crouch has to say. And you know, Andy's our creating culture guy. He's one of a group of younger at the time. So this article on the incarnation and crucifixion is from 2001. So it's almost 20 years old. This is when Christians were first starting to wrestle with this term postmodernism. I came to Judea in 1996, so it was not too long after I'd been there. So Andy gives us these kind of characterizations, and you got to kind of look for them because he doesn't number them, and they're not all from him. For some, postmodernism refers to a renewed attention to the other or the marginalized. So that's the first characteristic of how Andy Crouch is defining postmodernism. Now, this attention to the marginalized has led many postmoderns to a profound skepticism toward modernity's assumptions about knowledge, truth, and reason. That's the suspicion of the meta-narrative. That's what he's communicating. And then he says, you know, with this, though, comes some ambiguity. In this way, postmodernism is relativist, but it's not relativist across the board because it actually has a certain perspective, a perspective of the truth claims of the marginalized who are given quite a lot of validity in the postmodern epistemological scheme. Now, you know, that's a fancy way of saying that, you know, postmodernism does have maybe not a meta-narrative, but it has a perspective of giving agency to more people, especially people who have been on the outside. And then there's a little aside in the next paragraph down there. Postmodernism is also used to refer to advanced consumer capitalism, in which the prevalence of choice has rendered everything level. Western consumers now find themselves in a sea of options and choices. That aspect of postmodernism is less philosophical, it's more social, more sociological. This idea that even this irony that even though we talk about this great discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots in modern society, in a lot of ways consumerism has made a lot of things that used to be only for the privileged available to almost everybody. And Postman talks about that in his book when he makes the assertion that no matter where you are in the socioeconomic status, everybody's got a television. Well, you could almost say that today, no matter where you are in the socioeconomic status, everybody's got a cell phone. How does that happen? Those things aren't cheap. So this is another sort of postmodern thing, this leveling, ironically, through advanced consumer capitalism. Now let's get to this idea of the incarnation. Down about the middle of the page, postmodern Christians, we're hearing, think a lot about incarnation. And he's talking about younger postmodern thinking Christians, postmodern aware Christians. Why would the incarnation have something to do with this postmodern shift? This is a key thing. Because the incarnation is all about God becoming the other, becoming human, becoming like us. And this is the ultimate expression of reaching out to the marginalized. Jesus's whole ministry on this earth was oriented toward what, you know, in the vineyard they call it the lost, the least, and the last. Those are the people that Jesus ministered to. That was in his incarnate state. That's who mattered to him. And the paragraph that starts, Vincent Bocotti, relationships are so pivotal to impacting people with the message. So the postmodern thing, the postmodern shift creates this dynamic where the spreading of the gospel is not come to church on Sunday. Most of the people who are in church on Sunday are already believers. The spreading of the gospel is done person by person through relationships. You've got to build relationships with people first to get them to accept you so that you can then let them in on the story that defines who you are. But it's got to start with a relationship. Truth is not a syllogism. See, for most of the 20th century, even the church, even the evangelical church in America, thought in terms of preaching the truth, right? Preaching the gospel, evangelism, laying things out reasonably, rationally. This is what it means to be a Christian. But he says truth, she says, Sherry King, truth is embodied in the person and flesh of Jesus Christ our Lord. So now, in this postmodern situation, our witness is our life. Our witness is not me standing on a corner proclaiming the gospel. Our witness is our life, and the life the Jesus that people see in us. This is what I admire in Rich so much, and we'll talk more about that toward the end of the year. So the cross, in the last paragraph, the cross is what guarantees the Christian gospel against the critiques of postmodernism, especially the one that says all meta-narratives oppress. The gospel is the greatest meta-narrative ever. It's the greatest story ever told. It claims to tell the truth about the world. The problem with such stories is that they tell the truth in a way usually that benefits someone. But the cross is a story in which the other is met by the non-other. God becomes the other and endures the full experience of marginalization. That's what makes the incarnation and the crucifixion speak so powerfully to younger Christians who would identify as postmodernism. But now we're at a point where the more buzzwords are like postmodernism if we moved beyond that. So I'd like to see your comments on this video to see, what you think about the possibilities that this postmodern shift offers us in terms of Christians, the challenges that we face, because we are making truth claims. We are definitely not relativistic in the way that we understand. How can postmodern thinking kind of stretch your mind and help you be prepared to be a witness in this world the way that God calls you to be? So that's your next thought paper, is to discuss the possibilities and the challenges of being Christian, being a Christian witness in this postmodern world. So that's due sometime next week. That's the last thought paper you're going to write, so have fun with that. And get that to me sometime next week. And last but not least, I meant to say this at the beginning of the video. I'll say it in the notes. A lot of people have been sending me questions about, how do I do this creative thing? What's it supposed to look like? And Marina sent, I sent her an example. A lot of you are doing things like poverty and homelessness. So what I want you to do after this video, I may be able to figure out how to embed it at the end when I'm done here, when I actually post this, but I'm not sure I can figure that out. So if you will, in the YouTube search, type Steeple Song by Don Francisco. Steeple Song by Don Francisco. And now this is a really, and do the video, not the black and white one that just has lyrics, but I think the second one down actually has images that go along with the song. This is one of the first Christian songs I can remember. Don Francisco was one of the first Christian artists I was ever aware of back in the 70s, early 80s. Late 70s, early 80s. It's a challenging song. I mean, it's a little harsh, it's a little judgmental, but to do something like that speaks truth to the need of poverty, speaks truth to the need of homelessness, and points out why do these problems exist? Because we're not acting the way toward other human beings the way God would call us to ask. So watch that video, and maybe that'll inspire some of you in some of the ways that you can creatively address your issue. And send me questions if you want. Be sure and post some comments on this video about what you think about postmodernism. So this is another one of my little daily devotional things, Augustine Day by Day. I actually got this at a monastery in Wisconsin, the Holy Hill Monastery. Augustine Day by Day. So I just wanted to close with the little meditation and prayer for April 14th, a couple days ago. Yesterday, it was a couple days ago. I don't know. Anyway, this is called The Cross and the Resurrection. Jesus' cross is an example of painful toil. His resurrection is the reward of painful toil. In the cross, he showed us how we are to bear suffering. In his resurrection, he showed us what we are to hope for. And this is the prayer. You come, O Christ, humble in appearance. You were scorned, whipped, crucified, and killed. Yet on the third day you rose again, and on the 40th day you ascended into heaven, where you sit at the right hand of the Father. Amen? Amen. Okay, I love you guys. Have a great weekend. I'll be back next week.